The silence in this old house used to be a comfort, a quiet testament to a life well lived. Now it's a suffocating blanket, a constant reminder of what's been lost. For years, my world revolved around Arthur, my husband. We built this life together, brick by brick, laughter by laughter, and love by love. But time, that relentless thief, has stolen his vitality, leaving him a shadow of the man I married. Arthur, once a robust, vibrant man, is now frail, his mind often drifting into the mists of dementia. His needs are simple: food, medication, and the gentle reassurance that I'm still here. And I am. Every day I'm here. But a deep, gnawing emptiness has taken root within me. A vast, parched desert where once a lush garden bloomed. The intimacy that once defined our marriage has withered, leaving behind only the dry, brittle remnants of what was. It's not Arthur's fault. He's a victim of circumstance, just as I am. But the body remembers, doesn't it? The skin remembers the touch, the heart remembers the warmth, and the soul remembers the connection. For years, I've lived in this state of suspended animation, a quiet resignation to a life devoid of passion. It's not that I haven't tried. I've held Arthur close, whispered sweet nothings in his ear, hoping to spark a flicker of the old flame. But it's like trying to ignite damp wood. The spark dies before it can catch. Then came Daniel. He arrived like a breath of fresh air, a ray of sunshine in this dimly lit house. We needed help, of course. Arthur's condition had deteriorated to the point where I couldn't manage on my own. Daniel, a young man in his late 20s, was hired through a reputable agency. He had a gentle demeanor, a quiet strength that was immediately reassuring. He was respectful, efficient, and surprisingly perceptive. He seemed to anticipate Arthur's needs before they were even voiced. At first, I was wary. A young man in our home, so close to Arthur, so close to me. I'd spent a lifetime building walls, protecting my heart, and suddenly, here was this stranger, breaching those defenses with his quiet competence. But Daniel was nothing but professional. He treated Arthur with kindness and dignity, never condescending, always patient. He'd read to him, take him for short walks in the garden, and engage him in conversations, even when Arthur's responses were fragmented and incoherent. And he treated me with a respect that bordered on reverence. He'd address me as Mrs. Margaret, always polite, always attentive. He'd offer to help with chores, even those that weren't in his job description. And he'd always ask if there was anything else he could do. He was a constant, steady presence, a reliable anchor in the turbulent sea of my life. But there was something else, something unspoken, something that simmered beneath the surface of our interactions. It wasn't anything overt, just a subtle shift in the air when we were in the same room. A lingering glance, a fleeting touch, a shared smile that held a deeper meaning. It was as if we were both aware of the unspoken tension, the unspoken desire that hung between us. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself it was just my imagination, a product of my loneliness and frustration. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. I found myself looking forward to his arrival, anticipating his presence in the house. I'd linger in the kitchen, pretending to be busy, just to catch a glimpse of him as he passed by. I'd invent excuses to talk to him, to ask him questions, to hear the sound of his voice. And he, in turn, seemed to seek out my company. He'd often pause in his tasks to ask me about my day, to inquire about Arthur's condition, to offer a comforting word or a reassuring smile. He'd tell me about his own life, his family, his dreams, and aspirations. He was open and honest, sharing his vulnerabilities as well as his strengths. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, he came into the kitchen. He'd just finished giving Arthur his medication and was about to leave for the day. He paused at the doorway, his eyes meeting mine. "Mrs. Margaret," he said, his voice soft, "is there anything else I can do for you before I go?" I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to say, "Stay. Stay with me. Talk to me. Make me feel alive again." But instead, I just shook my head and said, "No, Daniel. Thank you. You've done enough." He nodded, a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "All right, I'll see you tomorrow." He turned to leave, but then paused again. "Mrs. Margaret," he said, turning back to face me, "you seem sad. Is everything all right?" I hesitated, my throat tight with emotion. I wanted to confide in him, to tell him about the emptiness that gnawed at my soul. But I couldn't. I couldn't bear the thought of burdening him with my problems. "I'm fine, Daniel," I said, forcing a smile, "just a little tired." He looked at me for a moment, his eyes searching mine. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, but if you ever need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." He left, leaving me standing in the kitchen, my heart aching with a longing I couldn't name. I watched him walk down the hallway, his figure disappearing into the shadows. I felt a pang of regret, a sense of missed opportunity. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the conversation with Daniel. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that a line had been crossed, even if it was only in my own mind. I was drawn to him, to his kindness, his strength, his quiet understanding, and I knew deep down that he was drawn to me too. The dry spell, the emotional and physical drought that had plagued my life, was about to break, and Daniel, the gentle caregiver, was about to become the catalyst for a storm of forbidden desires. If you are enjoying this story, please like and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these stories coming. If you have a story you wish to hear or a theme you would like to explore, please leave a comment down below. The air in the house had thickened, a palpable tension that hummed beneath the surface of our daily routines. Daniel's presence, once a comforting background hum, now felt like a spotlight, illuminating every unspoken thought, every lingering glance. I found myself hyper-aware of his movements, the sound of his footsteps, the scent of his skin. It was a strange, unsettling sensation, like being caught in a dream where every detail was magnified, every emotion amplified. Arthur's condition remained unchanged, a slow, steady decline that seemed to drain the life from the house. I tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, to adhere to the routines that had structured our lives for so long. But the undercurrent of desire, the unspoken attraction between Daniel and me, made every interaction a tightrope walk, a delicate dance on the precipice of something forbidden. One afternoon, I was in the living room, sorting through some old photographs, a bittersweet task that always brought a pang of nostalgia. Arthur was resting in his room, and Daniel was busy in the kitchen, preparing his lunch. I was lost in the memories, the faded images of a life that seemed both familiar and distant. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I turned to see Daniel standing in the doorway, a tray of food in his hands. He looked at me, his eyes softening as he took in my expression. "Mrs. Margaret," he said softly, "are you all right?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Just looking through some old photos," I said, gesturing to the pile on the coffee table. He walked over and sat beside me, placing the tray on the table. He picked up one of the photographs, a black and white image of Arthur and me on our wedding day. "You were very beautiful," he said, his voice hushed. I looked at the photograph, a wave of emotion washing over me. "We were happy," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He placed the photograph back on the table and turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "You're still beautiful, Mrs. Margaret," he said, his voice low and sincere. I felt a blush creeping up my neck, a sensation I hadn't experienced in years. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Thank you, Daniel," I said, my voice trembling slightly. He reached out and gently took my hand, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through my body. I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mrs. Margaret," he said, his voice barely audible. "I know I shouldn't say this, but—" He hesitated, his eyes filled with a mixture of desire and apprehension. "But what, Daniel?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He took a deep breath, his grip on my hand tightening. I'm drawn to you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help it." My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to tell him to stop, to pull away, to maintain the facade of propriety, but I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. I was trapped in the moment, caught in the pull of his gaze. He leaned closer, his eyes searching mine, seeking permission. I closed my eyes, my body trembling with anticipation. And then it happened. His lips brushed against mine, a feather-light touch that sent a shockwave through my body. It was a brief, tentative kiss, a mere suggestion of what could be. But it was enough. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest. He was looking at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of apology and desire. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Margaret," he said, his voice hoarse. "I shouldn't have done that." I shook my head, unable to speak. I was overwhelmed by a flood of emotions, a mix of guilt, shame, and a long-dormant desire that had suddenly been awakened. He stood up, his face flushed. I'll go check on Arthur," he said, his voice trembling. He turned and walked away, leaving me sitting on the sofa, my body still tingling from his touch. I brought my hand to my lips, tracing the spot where his kiss had landed. It was a forbidden pleasure, a stolen moment that had ignited a fire within me. The next few days were a blur. Daniel and I avoided each other, our interactions strained and awkward. We were both aware of the line we had crossed, the unspoken desire that hung between us. But neither of us dared to acknowledge it. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, Daniel came into the kitchen. He stood in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Mrs. Margaret," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." I turned to him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yes, Daniel," I said, my voice barely audible. He took a deep breath and walked towards me, stopping a few feet away. "I know what happened the other day was wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "I shouldn't have kissed you. I'm sorry." I nodded, unable to speak. "But," he continued, his voice gaining strength, "I can't deny what I feel. I'm drawn to you, Mrs. Margaret. I've never felt this way about anyone before." I looked at him, my eyes filled with tears. "Daniel," I said, my voice breaking, "this is wrong. We can't—" "I know," he interrupted, his voice urgent, "but I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop wanting you." He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "Please, Mrs. Margaret," he whispered, "just give me a chance." I hesitated, my mind reeling. I knew this was wrong, that I was betraying Arthur, betraying everything I believed in. but the desire, the longing, was too strong to resist. "Daniel," I said, my voice barely audible. He reached out and gently took my hand, his touch sending a wave of warmth through my body. "Please, Mrs. Margaret," he whispered, his eyes pleading. "Just one chance." I looked at him, my eyes filled with tears, and then I nodded. He smiled, a slow, hesitant smile that lit up his face. He leaned closer, his lips brushing against mine. This time, the kiss was deeper, more passionate, a declaration of our forbidden desire. The accidental touch, the stolen kiss, had awakened something within me, a long dormant desire that had been buried beneath years of routine and resignation. And Daniel, the gentle caregiver, had become the catalyst for my awakening. The forbidden fruit that I couldn't resist. The house, once a sanctuary of quiet routine, now thrummed with a secret energy. Every creak of the floorboard, every rustle of the curtains, was imbued with a new meaning, a hidden language that only Daniel and I understood. Our stolen moments were brief, snatched between Arthur's naps and medication schedules, but they were charged with an intensity that made time stand still. The guilt, of course, was a constant companion. The image of Arthur, frail and vulnerable, would flash through my mind, a stark reminder of my betrayal. But the desire, the sheer physicality of our connection, was overwhelming, a force that swept away all reason and restrained. Our first real encounter happened in the guest room, a dusty, forgotten space that had been untouched for years. It was a spontaneous decision, a sudden surge of desire that couldn't be denied. Daniel had been helping me with the laundry, and as we were folding sheets, our hands brushed. The spark was instant, a wildfire that spread through our bodies. We stumbled into the guest room, our clothes falling away like discarded burdens. The years melted away, the weight of responsibility, the guilt, the fear, all forgotten in the heat of the moment. Daniel's touch was gentle yet firm, his hands exploring my body with a reverence that made me feel cherished. And the pleasure, oh, the pleasure. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced, a volcanic eruption of sensation that shattered the years of drought. Daniel, young and virile, awakened a part of me that I thought had died, a primal hunger that had been dormant for far too long. We made love that day with an urgency that bordered on desperation, our bodies clinging to each other as if to hold back the tide of time. It was a release, a catharsis, a rediscovery of self. In Daniel's arms, I was not just a caregiver, a wife, a woman burdened by responsibility. I was simply a woman, desired, cherished, and alive. Our secret rendezvous became a regular occurrence, a stolen symphony played in the quiet corners of the house. The guest room, the study, even the laundry room became our clandestine havens, where we could shed our roles and surrender to the forbidden pleasure. Daniel was a skilled lover, attentive and intuitive. He seemed to know exactly what I needed, how to touch me, how to make me feel. He brought a youthful energy to our encounters, a playful curiosity that rekindled my own sense of adventure. But it wasn't just the physicality. Daniel was also a companion, a confidant. In the quiet moments after our lovemaking, we would talk, sharing our fears, our dreams, our vulnerabilities. He listened with a patience that Arthur, in his current state, could no longer offer. He saw me, not just as a wife or a caregiver, but as a woman with desires, with needs, with a life that extended beyond the walls of this house. With Daniel, I felt seen, heard, and desired. It was a heady mix, a potent cocktail that both intoxicated and terrified me. The guilt was still there, a nagging voice in the back of my mind, but it was drowned out by the symphony of our forbidden love. One afternoon, as we lay entwined in the guest room, Daniel's hand tracing patterns on my skin, I confessed my fears. "Daniel," I whispered, my voice trembling, "I'm scared. This is wrong. I'm betraying Arthur." He looked at me, his eyes filled with concern. "Margaret," he said softly, "I know, but we're not hurting anyone. We're just finding comfort in each other." "But what if he finds out?" I asked, my voice filled with dread. He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking my cheeks. "He won't," he said, his voice firm. "We'll be careful, I promise." I looked at him, searching his eyes for reassurance. And I found it. In that moment, I believed him. I believed that we could keep our secret, that we could continue to find solace in each other's arms without hurting Arthur. But deep down, I knew it was a lie, a beautiful, comforting lie that I desperately wanted to believe. The truth was, we were playing with fire, and sooner or later, we would get burned. Our affair continued, a secret dance in the shadows, a stolen symphony played in the quiet corners of the house. The pleasure was intense, the guilt was overwhelming, and the fear of discovery was a constant shadow. But in those stolen moments, in Daniel's arms, I felt alive. The charade couldn't last forever. The weight of my secret, the constant fear of discovery, began to take its toll. Sleep became a battlefield where guilt and desire waged war, leaving me exhausted and emotionally drained. The lines between my roles as wife and lover blurred, and I found myself slipping, making mistakes. One morning, while helping Arthur with his breakfast, I accidentally called him Daniel. The look of confusion on his face, the flicker of understanding in his eyes, sent a chill down my spine. He didn't say anything, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't continue this way, living a lie, betraying the man who had loved me for over 40 years. The guilt was suffocating, a heavy cloak that threatened to smother me. I made a decision. I would confess. The next morning, after Daniel had left for the day, I sat down with Arthur. He was in his armchair, his gaze fixed on the television, his mind lost in the fog of dementia. I took his hand, his skin papery and thin, and spoke. "Arthur," I said, my voice trembling, "I have something to tell you." He looked at me, his eyes cloudy with confusion. "Margaret," he said, his voice a faint whisper. I took a deep breath and began. I told him everything, about the emptiness, the loneliness, the desire, about Daniel, the accidental touch, the forbidden pleasure. I poured out my heart, my words tumbling over each other in a torrent of guilt and shame. To my surprise, Arthur listened patiently. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge. When I finished, he simply looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. "Margaret," he said, his voice weak but clear. "I understand." I stared at him, stunned. "You do?" He nodded slowly. "I may be old, and my mind may be failing, but I'm not stupid. I've seen the way you look at him, the way he looks at you." He squeezed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "I'm not angry, Margaret, just sad. Sad that we couldn't find a way to bridge the gap, to rekindle the flame." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the window. "But I also understand your needs. You're a woman, Margaret, a vibrant, beautiful woman. You deserve to be happy." Tears streamed down my face. I had expected anger, accusations, maybe even rejection. But instead, I received understanding, compassion, and a love that transcended the physical. In that moment, I realized the depth of Arthur's love. It wasn't just about passion or intimacy, it was about acceptance, about wanting the best for me, even if it meant letting me go. The confession was a turning point. It lifted the weight of secrecy, freeing me from the shackles of guilt. But it also marked the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with uncertainty and change. Daniel left the agency shortly after my confession. He understood the situation, the delicate balance that had been disrupted. We parted ways with a bittersweet mix of sadness and gratitude. He had awakened a part of me that I thought had died, and for that, I would always be grateful. Arthur's condition continued to deteriorate, but our relationship deepened. The confession had cleared the air, allowing us to connect on a new level, one based on honesty and compassion. We spent our days reminiscing, sharing stories, and simply enjoying each other's company. I continued to care for Arthur until his passing a year later. His death left a void in my life, a deep ache that time couldn't erase. But I also felt a sense of peace, knowing that we had found a way to navigate the challenges of aging and illness with love and understanding. Looking back, I don't regret my affair with Daniel. It was a mistake, yes, but it was also a gift. It reminded me that I was still a woman, capable of passion and desire. It reawakened a part of me that had been dormant for far too long. But more importantly, it led me back to Arthur, to a love that had endured the test of time and illness. It allowed us to rediscover each other, to find a new kind of intimacy, one based on compassion, acceptance, and a deep, abiding love. And that, in the end, was the greatest gift of all. Thank you for listening to my story. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. And if you have a story of your own that you'd like to share, please leave a comment below. We're all in this together, navigating the complexities of life and love. And sometimes all we need is someone to listen.